Hello there. Welcome to the second weekly podcast for Ashes Cricket 2013. I do realise that it's slightly unusual that a weekly podcast would have 2 months in between its first and second. I think I did actually write an explanation for this on the forums, but it takes a big man to apologise, and I'm not a particularly big man. But seriously, yes, no, I am sorry that it's taken so long. I think originally when I promised a weekly podcast, I think I had in mind I'd seen some other developer podcasts where people ask lots of questions about games in general or sport in general or whatever. I didn't expect that almost exclusively the questions that you'd have for me were all about the game and very specific things about the game. Which unfortunately we're not able to talk about just yet. So it will get more regular from now up until release, because slowly we'll be leaking out these details about the game and answering those questions through those. And I'll be happy to take follow-up questions on the forums. But yes, again, I do apologise that there's been quite such a gap in between the podcasts. I say they'll get more regular from now on. Okay, so let's jump straight in. I've got two questions to answer this week of the rather bulky variety. So apologies in advance for rambling. But these two questions have been asked a lot. One of them in particular. The first one is, why have we not yet showed you any screenshots or trailers? Now I promised a very lengthy explanation for this because, as I say, this is the most asked question by quite some distance. So basically, there are two main issues. Visual stuff is really restricted by licensing. Now, the licensing we have in the game is brilliant because it makes everything authentic and realistic, and it's very important to us. And I think it's absolutely key for sales. In my opinion, the licenses are fantastic. Unfortunately, it does have a knock-on effect in terms of the visual elements of the games, because it means we can't show any licensed stadiums or kits or uniforms or even players until everything is approved by whoever owns that property. Now, as sponsors and squads and indeed all sorts of things can change throughout the production of the game, what we usually do is wait till the last possible opportunity to get them in the game, and then we get them approved. Otherwise, we could spend potentially ages building, I don't know, like a licensed stadium, only then to see parts of it almost completely rebuilt, or bits added to it closer to the launch. So it would have kind of been a waste to build those things before we've got the absolute final versions of it. That does mean that we wouldn't be able to send out screens, because obviously all of the stadiums or whatever would be out of date. Same applies to players, maybe in and out of the squad. Some uniforms, the tournament and ground sponsors, kit manufacturers, new bats, and a lot of that we get secret information ahead of time from those people, from those license holders, and sometimes we can't go public with it until the license holder has actually announced it themselves. The second big factor with this is that the nature of a sports games development is maybe slightly different to a lot of other types of game. If you've got a first-person shooter, for example, you generally build it level by level, and it's quite modular in the way that you build it. So you build level 1, then you build level 2, etc., etc. Now, most publishers these days want to see what's called a vertical slice. That basically just means a very small section of the game up to full finished quality, with the mechanics and the visuals, so that they can prove that the game is going to be awesome before they give the developer the rest of the money to make the rest. I guess the theory being, if you can't make a small part of the game look and feel good, you're not going to spend more money until you fix that first. So the really big games almost always have this now, which means right at the start of full development, and I mean that these days that can be 1 or maybe even 2 years before release, in some cases 3 or 4, you basically have something that you can take screenshots or video of, which is representative of the final quality of the game. also what helps you there is that if it's an intellectual property that you own and you can do what you like with it, that again, the licenses potentially stop you doing this anyway. So yeah, you normally build one or two really nice looking sections, and you can do all your public materials from there until later on where you might get more. Sports games are tricky because you can't really make it in subsections. Once you have a fully functioning sample of gameplay, you've basically got the whole game. Almost 80–90% of the work in making a sports game is teaching a computer how to play a sport. So with our development, we spend a long time making the gameplay, and then nearer the end of production is where we really crank up the artwork and the special effects, which means that really there's nothing visually 100% finished until really quite late on in the game. And obviously I don't want to show you something that looks half finished. There is a way that you can do it. Sometimes developers will mock something up just for the sake of putting out the screen or two. It would actually normally those use the game engine, but then an artist would take it and touch everything up to kind of make it look like what they expect it to look like when it will be finished. This is called a target render, if you want to get technical. It's basically a kind of a screenshot which is the quality that you think you can reach. I don't like those a lot because it causes a lot of upset, because sometimes the game comes out and it doesn't look like it did in the early screenshot, and people get very mad about it, and they assume that they would be being duped. I've seen games do that in the past. Like, developers probably thought that they could make it look like their target and fall short for whatever reason. There's been a few games recently that have been quite widely lambasted about it. A lot of consumers get very angry about it. So if you can possibly avoid it, I would always take the option to wait until I had like actual accurate representations, which is what we're doing. I do apologize. It's a big long rant, but it is a question that comes up so much, and I thought it was worth explaining it properly, making sure that people don't think that there's any nefarious means or kind of cloak and dagger stuff going on behind it. Basically, we want to show you screens. We will do so as soon as they are ready to show. Right, the other big question that I've got this week is about motion control. Quite a few people have been asking about motion controls. This is something that we decided very early on. So here's where I stand on it. We've experimented with different controls for a long time now in cricket games. In the old days, you just had directions and buttons, and you used what you had. There are now all sorts of different inputs for games, touch screens, motion controls, cameras, etc., etc. So we're always looking into how best they can be used to enhance the cricketing experience. Now, I'm always being told, lots of you've mentioned it, that cricket and motion control should go together. Two things that they should go together like two things that go together really well. Whenever I've tried to use them like I want to use them in a cricket game, it just doesn't work. And I'll tell you why. So first, there's no way that you want to bowl with motion control. It's too tiring. Okay, I mean when I say most people, I mean the vast majority of people, and those are the ones that I need to buy the game to make it financially viable. Test matches, like long spells of bowling, all that energy, no way. Now batting, I think it's a much more sensible idea. The problem is what you really want from it when you're using it is one-to-one movement. You want it to behave exactly like a bat is like extending from the controller, if you can imagine that, and you use the controller like the grip, and it seems to make sense. But the trouble is that if it is one-to-one movement, and it would need to be one-to-one movement, like it would all be proper physics. So my problem is you'd basically have to be a professional cricketer in order to play it properly, or in order to play it really well. If you are of that standard, then I don't think you'd be sitting at home playing a game. I think you'd be trying out for your state or county team. Now, it might work really well as a simulator, like a nets practice, or a training program, but I don't think it works as a game. Maybe like an extra game mode, I say in the nets, but then if you're using all of that resource, and it is a really big resource to do all of that one-to-one motion tracking and develop that, if you're using that there for a mode that only a handful of people are going to probably want to use, it's just not viable. So one-to-one motion control, I honestly don't think it could work. I agree it would be awesome fun to have it in a nets mode where you could practice batting, like real, and play against real bowlers. I think that's a great idea and something I would definitely consider looking at further down the road, but it would need to be a separate game mode, I think. Now the other way that you could use motion control is to somehow interpret the motions and help the player out a bit. So the key learning from previous Wii Cricket titles, I assume you realise that I'm talking about Big Beach Cricket. Simple timing stuff felt a little bit too simplistic, and it's not really enough of a challenge. It sacrifices a lot of gameplay, and a lot of it was simplified to the point of basically mirroring what you would have done with a controller. You may as well be pressing a button. It's not really true motion control. So we experimented at one point with using gestures. So basically the idea was that you would make a gesture with the motion controller, the computer would interpret what it thought that you were trying to do, but then to translate that back into the game, to process that gesture in time to fire an animation in the game associated with it, the gesture had to be made very much well in advance of the actual shot. I'm going for a technical moment right now. Basically, for a fast bowler, we have something like 14 frames, which is kind of half a second, just over half a second, between the time that the ball leaves the bowler's hand and the time that it passes the bat, or at least the time you need to start the animation for a batting shot, which basically means that when batting, if you were doing that, the player had to play your shot so that it could recognize the gesture to play the animation before the ball had actually left the bowler's hand, in order for it to actually work. Now we played around with that, and it made a really, really incredibly disjointed experience. The player's movement, so you would play a shot, the bowler would bowl it, the batsman would do an animation, and basically it just felt like you weren't batting. It felt very silly. But basically that's the two options. So your controls would have to be dumbed down, and I don't really think there's a way to do that very well that's enjoyable. Or the game would be so difficult that only like an elite few people would actually be able to play it, and it would become more of a simulator than a game. Now, so I'm not suggesting that it can't be done. I'm sure there's a way that you could make that work. But I don't think that the value is anywhere near the cost. And when I talk about cost, I mean like the cost of time, people resource, design resource. There's a huge amount of prototyping and then design, production, technical work in order to support motion controls in the way that they deserve to be supported. Long rant aside, not this time. There will be no motion control, but I'd be incredibly interested if anybody out there thinks that they can solve that and they've got some good ideas for how you could actually do motion control, then I'm all ears. I'd love to hear them. So those basically are the two things that I'm going to talk about this time around. I know it's been a long gap in between them, and I know I've only technically answered 2 questions, although I've really made a meal of it. But keep them coming. I say we will start releasing more and more information now. right up until release. Then I'll be able to tell you very specific answers to your very specific questions. I apologise, I can't answer them right now. I know lots of you have been leaving a long trail of questions almost daily. There is definitely a plan to roll all of those answers out over the next couple of months, and obviously as we get closer to release, the information will get more and more specific. There's a plan for announcing those individual features, and I say I'll follow it up as soon as I come off the back of those. Please continue to send them in. I will give the web address, which is www.ashescricket2013.com. Chances are, if you're listening to this, you already know where that is. On there you can find the links to our Twitter and our Facebook, and indeed our forums, to say where I'm answering all of these questions. Thank you very much for listening. If you're still listening, we'll be back with these. I will definitely try and do one in the next week. Thanks.